In this video we will present the second part of the novel The 40 Rules of Love by the writer Elif Shafak. During the first part we talked about Ella, the housewife who lives a very monotonous life devoid of love. But when her first work was reading the novel of The Sweet Blasphemy by the writer Aziz Zawar, her life completely changed, especially when she communicates with Aziz and eventually abandon everything to join him. In this part, we will talk about the novel Sweet Blasphemy, which tells the story of the strange meeting between the scholar Jalal al-Din al-Rumi and the mystic Shams Al-Tabrizi, and how Shams shook the world of Rumi like an earthquake, turning him from a religious scholar into a mystical poet and love advocate, and liberated him from all traditional restrictions and rules. Please watch the first part from the novel to be able to enjoy the full picture of the story. The 13th century was full of conflicts and wars everywhere in the world, and during that turbulent period, lived the venerable Islamic world Jalal al-Din Rumi, or what his disciples called Maulana in Konya. In the year 1244 AD, the Rumi met for the first time with Shams al-Tabrizi the traveler Darwish. A meeting changed both of them, especially the Rumi, who transformed from an ordinary cleric to a poet full of emotions and a committed Sufi, so he invented the dervishes' dance, and liberated from all traditional restrictions and rules, and, unlike many, he called for self-jihad. In a bar in Samarkand in the year 1242, Shams of Tabriz fell asleep and saw a vision of a middle-aged man, searching for him with sadness, calling out loudest to see the man at the end looking inside a well, and Shams saw himself killed inside the well, and then the man started screaming until his voice was broken. That moment Shams woke up at the voice of the bar owner, who asked him to stop screaming and leave his bar. Shams offered him to let him sleep and eat, in exchange for interpret his dreams to him. The owner of the bar refused his offer, and advised him to stop being a traveler Darwish as there is nothing to look for. Shams explained to him that he is searching for God, and this search does not stop. Shams stood up and offered to the owner of the bar to read his palm. So he grabbed his right hand and examined the deep cracked lines of his hand. Shams attributed him for losing his wife and unborn child, and told him that she did not suffer with her death and that what happened was not his fault, and they moved peacefully to the other world. The bar owner pulled his hand and agreed to him to spend the night at the bar. At night, Shams lay on the mattress provided by the bar owner, in a room where more than 10 men were sleeping. He thought of his childhood, and that although his father wanted his son to be a normal child and inherit his profession in carpentry, but Shams was not normal. He was able to see angels and God, and visions since a young age, which made his father sad and could not accept his difference, and also Shams could not remain in his village, especially with the increasing visions, so he left the house bearing the memory of the scent of cut wood and bread made by his mother's hands, and from that time he became a Darwish, moved to every place. He earned some money from interpreting dreams, got to know all kinds of people, saw the worst and best of humanity, until there was nothing could surprise him. During his travels, he compiled a list that he did not write down, but he dug with his spirit, calling it the basic principles of the wandering Sufis in Islam, or the 40 rules of love for the religion of love. Shams remembered the vision he saw earlier, and realized that his time is about to over, so he prayed God to enable him to forward his stories, and knowledge, and rules to someone else. At a moment, a light landed in the room and his guardian angel told him to go to Baghdad, whether he would find the way to his companion. Shams al-Tabrizi arrived to the dervishes' hospice in Baghdad and introduced himself. The head of the hospice, Baba Zaman, welcomed him, and asked him about the reason for his visit. Shams told him that his vision led him, as he has been wandering around the country for about 40 years, and that he has prayed to God to meet a companion to share the knowledge he has gathered, and that according to his vision, Baba Zaman knows the whereabouts of his companion and his name, and that he will tell him about him someday. And despite the strangeness the words of Shams, Baba Zaman welcomed his stay at the hospice. Shams al-Tabrizi spent 9 months at the hospice, and despite his dislikes of monotonous life and his need to be alone away, but he was patient as he needs to find a great companion. One day, a message arrived to Baba Zaman from the Sufi teacher Sayyid Burhan al-Din, telling him about Jalal al-Din al-Rumi, and that he has talent and wisdom. And how, at the age of 24, he became a spiritual leader in Kunya, and that thousands of devotees follow him. But the Rumi visited him as his teacher and his father's friend, and told him secretly that he felt empty and dissatisfied, and that he always saw a vision that he was looking for someone. And when Master Sayyid Burhan al-Din interpreted the Rumi's vision, he realized its meaning, which is that in Baba Zaman hospice, there is a Darwish will be the Rumi's companion, and he asked Baba Zaman to help him. Days passed since the arrival of the message, and Baba Zaman kept its contents secreted from everyone, until one day he summoned everyone to a meeting, and told them about the message, but without going into details, and told them that he needed a volunteer to accompany a religious scholar on his way to become a lover, a journey not in the name of duty but in the name of love. Shams persistently volunteered to leave. But Baba Zaman stood up and asked Shams to wait until spring, hoping that Shams would change his mind. But during the next 3 months Shams did not speak to anyone and had a bad temper, but he had patience himself. And when spring came, Baba Zaman summoned the dervishes again, and asked them the same question. But no one else but Shams volunteered. Baba Zaman told him that he must wait until the fall to inform him of his decision. Shams was shocked, as after waiting 3 months he had to wait another 6 months. And whatever he begged for Baba Zaman he refused to inform him, but Shams insisted on his stand, and he refused to give up. And upon the arrival of autumn, Baba Zaman summoned everyone for the 3rd time, and when he noticed the increased insistence and determination in Shams' eyes, he gave him a sealed letter, which Shams opened to know that he would go to Kunya to meet a scholar called the Rumi. At dawn, Shams bade farewell to Baba Zaman, who prayed God for his safety, and presented him a box containing a silver mirror, a silk handkerchief and a bottle of balm to help him during his journey. Shams thanked him and left on his horse. In Kunya, the Rumi woke up for another night screaming, and woke up his wife, Kyra, terrified from the dream that worries her husband every night. Al-Rumi apologized to her, and went out to the garden in which he sees himself every night, looking for a man, to finally look inside the well to see that man lying in it, where he started crying and screaming. When Shams Al-Tabrizi arrived at the entrance to Kunya, he greeted the tutors and the saints, they endued him with their blessing, and went to the sugar merchant's khan. After that, he set off for his tour of the city, admiring its cultural, religious and linguistic diversity, and spoke to many. And he felt love for all those who struggle for a livelihood, and kept his tour till he reached one of the poor neighborhood, where he found a house with a wonderful garden. He stood in front of it. The owner of the house kicked him out and told him that the brothels are not a place for dervishes. Shams explained to her that he admired her garden. The owner of the house pointed to a lady, and told Shams that one of her girls called the Desert Rose had planted it. Shams looked to the girl, and informed the owner that one day this girl will embark on a spiritual journey, and he asked her not to stop her. Since the day when the Desert Rose met Shams, she felt a desire to go to the mosque to attend Rumi's sermon. So, she lied to the house owner to let her go out, and disguised herself as men's clothes and went to the mosque. The Desert Rose was born in a simple village, whose parents were faithful Christians who worked as bakers. When she was 7 years old her mother died at her brother's birth. His father hated him greatly and mistreated him, also his new wife participated in the torture of her brother. One day, they found her father and his wife murdered, and her brother ran away on suspicion of killing them, to find herself alone, so she left her village to live with her aunt in Constantinople. But on the way, the bandits attacked them, stole the caravan and the horses, kidnapped her and drove her into the forest, where the thieves and their families resided. But in the end, she managed to escape. And when she reached Constantinople, she realized that the situation was worse, as she was raped several times, and she lived a bad life until her path led her to the brothel in which she has been working for 9 years. When the Desert Rose reached the mosque, she sat in the place reserved for men, hiding her face, and listened to the Rumi's speech in which he talked about suffering, where she forgot all about her suffering, and felt tranquility. Shams did not attend the Rumi's sermon, but he stood in front of the mosque. Then he approached the seated leper, the beggar, and saluted him and sat opposite him under the astonishment of the leper, as no one addressed him, as if they saw the ugliness of death when they looked at his face. Shams introduced himself, and took out the silver mirror and presented it to him, and told him that he needs it to remind him that he is carrying God within him, and that he should not resent God's judgment. Then they heard pandemonium and fanfare and angry voices raised, and the matter became clear. They discovered the presence of a prostitute woman in the mosque. The men shoved her, demanding of flogging her. Shams rushed towards the crowds and shouted at them, so the desert rose hid behind him, and everyone was demanding of punishing her. Shams despised them, so do they want to punish the woman for entering the mosque? Then the desert rose fled, and the men tried to pursue her, but Shams stopped them. The desert rose was exhausted. She leaned against a wall in one of the streets, thinking of everything that had happened, since while she was sitting in the mosque, her scarf was loosened. Because Babers, one of the house's customers, identified her, and incited everyone against her. And when she tried to escape she couldn't, as Babers and his friends followed her and kicked her out of the mosque. While she was taking her breath, she looked behind her to find Shams. He told her that she is a good person, but her aura had lost its luster with time, because she had convinced herself that she was bad inside and out. Then Shams took a silk handkerchief from his pocket and presented it to her, as it will remind her that her heart is pure and that she carries God inside her. At the end of Rumi's sermon, he left in a convoy accompanied by his followers. And while they were passing through the streets of Cunha, they happened to pass in front of the Christo's bar, and their voices woke up Suleiman, so Suleiman opened the window of the pub to see them, then threw a stone that almost hit one of them, so Christo closed the window and asked Suleiman to be careful, as most of them hate seeing a Muslim man in the bar, but Suleiman did not care and stand to recite the Qiyam poem. At midnight, Suleiman left the pub, grogging, and on his way, 2 guards met him and insulted him because he was drunk. Suleiman talked with them sarcastically, and one of them began to whip him tightly with the whip until his colleague stopped him and called him by the name Babers, and then they left Suleiman on the ground, agonizing all of his body. After minutes Shams approached him, introduced himself and helped him to sit down, and gave him a packet of balm, asked him to anoint his wounds, and told him that his internal wound is bigger and greater, and that he should remember that he carries God inside him. He comforted him because the guard hated him, and they had no right to do so, for every person searches for God in his own way, and when Suleiman could not stand, Shams carried him and drove him to his home. Then Suleiman sat alone, and despite his sadness and pain he felt reassured, for he knew that God exists and loves him. The night before Shams met with the Rumi, he sat at the balcony of the Khan and remembered the people whom he had met. The beggar, the drunk, and the prostitute. And thought that all 3 of them suffered from the disease of separation from the one God. He contemplated the calm of the city and the stars in the sky. And thought of the Rumi, and what kind of man he is. Tomorrow he will meet his companion for the first time. On the next day, Rumi finished his sermon, and went out of the mosque surrounded by the crowds. Rode his white horse and took small steps. Then Shams advanced and stood in front of the procession and looked at the Rumi, and told him that he had come to ask him a question, but before he asked him the question he asked him to get off his horse so that they became equivalent. The Rumi was stunned, as no one ever addressed him this way, but he got off his horse. And Shams asked him a controversial question. And despite everyone's disapproval of the question, the answer given by the Rumi was liked by Shams, who smiled broadly and affectionately bowed to the Rumi and thanked him. Rumi bowed in front of him too, under everyone's surprise, as no one ever saw him bow to anyone, and when Shams wanted to leave, the Rumi asked him to stay, since he realized that he had found the companion who always sees in his dreams. On the next day, Aladdin, the Rumi's son, returned of his hunting trip with his friends, to hear the news of his father's meeting with the Darwish Shams Al-Tabrizi, and that he and his father had been sitting in his office since they arrived, and he prevented anyone from disturbing them. And during the 40 days that Shams and Al-Rumi spent in his office, they did not go out, and ate nothing but bread and milk. Aladdin tried every way to spy, but he could not see or hear anything. And on the 40th day Shams finished teaching the Rumi his rules of love, and they left the office. The novel took us back for 8 years, to get to know a little bit about the Rumi's adopted daughter, Kimia, who was born in a simple family, and since her childhood she felt different, as she was able to see ghosts. One day, a hermit visited their house, and told her parents that Kimia had talent and that he should teach her, and suggested that he accompany her to a prominent teacher who would teach her. After a while, when Kimia was 12 years old, she traveled with her father to Kunya, where they met the Rumi at the gate of his school. Her father explained to the Rumi what the hermit had told him, and that he hoped that he would accept her as student. Meanwhile, Kimia saw the ghost of a lady and started talking to her. And when the Rumi summoned her to speak to her, Kimia said even though she was a girl, she wanted to learn the Quran. And she told him about her seeing the ghost of his first wife, Jauhar, and that she would like him to help her. Then Kimia described to him the shape of his wife and her clothes. The Rumi cried, and promised her father to take care of her and teach her, and welcomed her to his home. Kimia is happy with her life, and she feels that God has granted her a second family, especially Kyra, the Rumi's wife, who treats her like her child, but the arrival of Shams Al-Tabrizi transformed her life and existence. Months have passed since Shams' existence in the Rumi's hospitality. Kyra felt that her husband had changed a lot, as if he was no longer the man she had been married to for 8 years, and she raised his 2 children from his first wife, and their daughter Kimia, and gave birth to her child. But he became connected to Shams. They do everything together. But despite her concern, Kyra reassured herself that what is happening with the Rumi is a temporary stage, as Shams will return at the end of his wandering, and that she must be patient, as the Rumi is the one who supported her when everyone refused their marriage because she is Christian. Throughout the novel, we get to know a little about the Rumi's feelings and his overwhelming happiness in finding his companion, his Shams. As he spent days feeling of missing something and loneliness, until Shams attended and taught him to redefine all the concepts that he knows, and to forget everything he knows. But he does not know a way to make his family and friends understand Shams and love him, and to enable them to see him as he does. As for the Rumi, Shams is the sea of his mercy, grace, truth, reality, and faith. And despite the rumors that surround him, he is full of love, and love cannot be explained, it is only possible to live it. During the time that Shams spent with the Rumi, Kyra was not the only one who felt anxious. But also Kimia was affected by the Rumi's absence from their lessons together. But she understood his absence and knew that something rare combined him with Shams. Unlike Aladdin, who seemed to hate Shams clearly, and his complaint increased about the absence of the Rumi, neglecting his family and his sermons at the mosque and his followers. Kimia decided to resume her lessons with the Quran on her own, but she found it difficult to interpret some verses, so she decided to ask the Rumi. In shyness she went to his office, and upon entering she found no one but Shams, who offered to help her, and explain the verses that were difficult for her. At that moment she realized with certainty the reason for the Rumi's attachment to him. On the other hand, and despite Sultan Walid, the eldest son of the Rumi, understood his father's relationship with Shams, but the growing rumors about them in the city made him feel sad. Wondering how people can't realize the meaning of the spiritual companionship that brings together his father and Shams, although there are many stories about spiritual companionship that formed the periods of wisdom and insight for comrades, such as the story of Moses and Al-Qadr that was mentioned in the Quran. One day, Shams and the Rumi decided to leave Kunya, rode the horses, wandered through the meadows and valleys, and at the entrance to Kunya they sat under a huge oak tree. They performed the dawn prayer, and Shams told him that his words help many people, and that he would help him along the path. Then Shams stood and drew a large circle, and raised his arms to the sky, and he started to repeat the glory names of God and revolve at the same time inside the circle slowly and quietly at the beginning, then with increasing speed, until the Rumis felt that the whole universe revolving with Shams, and a strange energy radiated from him. Getting back to the desert rose. As after she visited the mosque, the owner of the house prevented her from leaving it, and during the following months she neglected to take care of her appearance, as if it was no longer important. And also Shams visited her several times, reassured her, and taught her not to despair of God's mercy. One night Babers visited her, swallowing drink and hashish, and after he raped her, he asked her to be his lover. She refused, so Babers got mad and hit her with all his might till she could not feel pain anymore, and she felt she was floating in the ether. As she was falling upward, death no longer afraid her, and she was no longer afraid to leave the house, and imagined herself clean, pure, repentant, as Shams taught her, so she smiled despite the pain. Weeks passed since Kimia met with Shams for the first time, and she wanted to meet him again, but she did not have the opportunity to do so. Later, in one morning while she was working in the yard, she was surprised by the presence of Shams, and he started talking to her about fate and about divine love, and while they were talking, Kimia felt that she had fallen in love with him. She felt shy and ran inside the house. One afternoon, Shams entered the room in which the Rumi was sitting, and asked him to go to the bar to bring them wine, and perhaps he wanted to sit in the pub for a little while and talk to its visitors. The Rumi was surprised by his request, but Shams' tension was greater, since he was afraid the Rumi would reject his request, fearing for his reputation. But the Rumi surprised him by standing and telling Shams that he trusted him. And when the Rumi left the room, Shams thanked Allah for that he had given him a sincere companion, and prayed to God that the beautiful spirit of the Rumi would not woke up from drunkenness with divine adoration. Everyone was astonished when the Rumi entered the bar, so Suleiman thought that he was hallucinating, and silence prevailed for minutes, before Christos intervened, and sat the Rumi at the table on which Suleiman was sitting and presented him the 2 bottles of wine that he requested. Suleiman broke the silence and asked the Rumi about the reason for attending bar. The Rumi told him that he was passing a mystical experiment, and that Shams sent him to discredit him. Rumi spoke for a while with Suleiman and the others, and in the end, he carried the wine and left. In the evening, Aladdin decided to talk to his father about his desire to marry Kimia. But when he went to his father's office, he was surprised by the Rumi coming from outside carrying 2 bottles of wine, so Aladdin disapproved his father's behavior, and spoke hurtful words with him, and also insulted Shams, but the Rumi rebuked him and told him that his behavior embarrassed him, which increased Aladdin's anger and he left the house. Al-Rumi apologized for Aladdin's behavior, and went with Shams and sat in the garden. Shams had poured the wine on a rose and it blossomed, and kept the amount of a drinking cup. He drank half and presented the other half to the Rumi, whom took the cup in doubt, as he never drank alcohol throughout his life, but inside himself he trusts Shams. Then when he decided to drink the cup, Shams threw it away from his hand, and told him that he sent him to bring wine so that he could get out of the restrictions surrounding him, including the chains of fear of rumors, and to realize that spiritual growth lies in our awareness, not our apprehension of certain things. The next day, while Sheikh Yasin was on his way to school, he heard rumors that filled Kunya about the Rumi visit to the bar, which raised his assurance of Shams' bad influence. And when he went inside his class he found Shams sitting there, so get mad and kicked him out. Shams replied to him that he knew that he was spreading rumors all over Kunya about him and the Rumi, and he did not hide his contempt for all Sufis. Then Shams and Sheikh Yasin exchanged a rough debate, and Shams involved the students in it. And at the end, Shams mourned the mentality of Sheikh Yasin, and asked the students to open their hearts to religion, not just their minds, and saluted them and left, leaving them amazed. Later, when the guard Babers returned to his uncle Yasin's house at night, he knew what happened between him and Shams. Then he became angry. And what increased his anger and rage was when he returned days later to the brothel in search of the desert rose, to know that she escaped at the instigation of Shams. The Desert Rose chose the coldest days of the year to leave the house of prostitution. At midday, she collected her bag, and was determined to devote the rest of her life to God, and with all her courage she left the house forever. In the morning Kyra was surprised by the presence of the Desert Rose at her house, and she asked to meet Shams, and told Kyra her story. Kyra was afraid to enter her inside the house in the absence of the Rumi, but the sadness in her eyes and the wounds that filled her face prompted her to allow the Desert Rose to wait at the yard. And when Shams and the Rumi came, she ran toward Shams and kissed his hands. Shams smiled and wished her success on her journey to search for God, and since that day the Rumi hosted the Desert Rose at his home. Al-Rumi and Shams decided to perform their spiritual dance, Sama, for the first time, and on the evening's night, the hall was filled with people of various stripes and professions. Even Sheikh Yassin came with his students, as well as King Khosrow II attended, and the women sat in the back. Sultan Walid prayed to God that things would go well, and then the flute was played, and the Rumi appeared with 6 dervishes of his disciples. They wore long white robes wide below, and began to circle themselves, looking like lotus flowers. The scene was wonderful, and then Shams appeared like a gusty wind, and he began to rotate with his hands spreading to the sky at great speed. It seemed as if everyone fell under the magic of the dance and music, and the Rumi stood and repeated supplications and invocations. And when the dance ended, the Rumi spoke about the dance, that it will be the dance for all the dervishes and for all times. Then King Khosrow stood up, approached the stage and greeted the dervishes, congratulated the Rumi on the beautiful dance, and threw a sack full of gold coins on the stage. And as soon as he stepped towards the door, Shams threw the money bag at his feet, and said that they did not dance for money, but for the sake of love for God alone. A terrible silence reigned over the hall. King Kai left without uttering, his entourage followed him and everyone began to leave protesting, and the first of them was Sheikh Yassin and the Rumi son Al-Uldin, who left the house immediately and spent the night with his friends, whose words increased his displeasure of Shams, and that he must leave Kunya even by force. Days after that night, the Rumi entered his son Sultan's room tired and unable to stand, to tell him that Shams had gone, and had left him. Sultan Walid felt a kind of comfort due to the disappearance of Shams. Because of him, his father's hearing was distorted, and perhaps with his disappearance, all of their lives would return to what they were before Shams. But on the other hand, hearing his father's words that the absence of Shams kills him makes him feel ashamed. He spent the next week searching all the streets of Kunya for Shams, to discover a side of the city that he had not seen before. The impoverished, the poor, and outcasts. And was surprised that they all loved Shams who helped them, and did not judge any of them. But all this search was useless since he did not find a trace of him, so he decided to leave Kunya to search for him in Damascus. After 10 months of searching, Sultan found Shams playing chess with a Christian hermit under the sky of Damascus. Sultan begged him to return with him to Kunya, as his father needs him. But Shams realizes that if he returns to Kunya, he will not leave alive. But his heart also remains suspended in Kunya, and that he longs for the Rumi's companions to a degree that hurts him, and after several pleas from Sultan, Shams agreed to accompany him the next day. When Shams returned to Kunya, the Rumi welcomed him at its gate with flowers. But Rumi's anxiety and fear of Shams leaving increased again. Then Jauhar's ghost visited Kemia, and told her that the Rumi thinks that in the case of Shams' marriage, he may remain in Kunya. Kemia understood Jauhar's message, and went to the Rumi's office and informed her of her desire to marry Shams. The Rumi thanked her, thinking that she would marry Shams only to help him, but he does not know that she is in love with Shams as well, and after Eid al-Fitr they got married. On the wedding night, Shams entered his room to find Kemia sitting quietly. He approached her. Kemia presented herself like a rosebud, but Shams took steps back, and he left the room realizing his mistake in marriage, thinking that a man like him was not created for marriage. He wanted to escape from the house, the city, and even his body, but he could not desert the Rumi again. 7 months have passed since the wedding night, and Kimia begins to feel that everyone knows her secret that she is still a virgin. Shams visits her in her room sometimes, but only to talk, and he tells her stories and teaches the rules for love. Kimia doubts that Shams did not like her, began to tear her from the inside, so she isolated herself from everyone in her room and sometimes in the Desert Rose's room. One day, Kimia begged the Desert Rose to help her and make her beautiful in her husband's eyes. And despite her opposition at the beginning, but the Desert Rose felt that Kimia was doing this for love only, so she gave her advices and helped her to prepare, and one night after the Desert Rose helped Kimia to prepare, Kimia went late to the Shams room. She was completely adornment, but Shams refused her, so she felt offended and left the room sad. Kimia did not see Shams again, as after which she fell ill with a severe disease, all her powers disappeared, and the smell of death was all over the room, and Kyra was crying all the time, but even though, Kimia could not hate Shams, and after 10 days she passed away. Later, while Suleiman was at the pub, he heard people planning to kill Shams. And after they left, he went out of the pub and ran all the streets of the city looking for Shams, and when he did not find him, he returned to the pub to find Shams standing at its door. Suleiman embraced him and told him what he heard. Shams reassured him. He will not suffer except what God has written for him, and thanked him for offering him to stay in his home. In the evening, 3 men accompanied the killer headed to the Rumi's house. They wanted to make sure that he killed Shams. The killer hid in the garden and waited for a while. And then Shams appeared carrying a lantern. He walked directly towards the killer and greeted him, and Shams said that, God is an accurate timer, so everyone has a time for love, and a time for death. The killer quickly got out of his hiding place and struck Shams with his sword. Shams could easily avoid it, but then 6 people appeared and attacked Shams. He managed to bring them all down, and at the end the killer gathered with the other 6 and killed Shams, and threw his corpse into the garden well. And they waited for the sound of his body hitting the bottom, but they did not hear anything, so a terror spread among them. And when the Rumi came out they all fled. The Rumi went straight to the well, remembering his dream, and then he fell on his knees and hit his chest and shouted, They killed him, they killed my Shams. 3 weeks after Shams' death, Al-Aldin went to his father's office, trying with all his might to justify his help to the guard, Babers, and the others in getting rid of Shams, and that he did not know that they would kill him, but it was of no use. The Rumi did not want to talk to him, and Al-Aldin became certain that after what happened, his father would not be able to love him, and he would never forgive him. 16 years have passed since the Rumi met Shams for the first time. The Rumi changed a lot during those years, so he began to write poetry voraciously. And every year he vacates himself 40 days in which he remembers Shams and repeats his 40 rules of love. After killing Shams, he thought that he would not be able to live, but as if a third eye had been opened in his heart. He began to see Shams everywhere and in everything. And during those years the Rumi put the final touches on his dervishes' dance. As he heard the divine rhythm that Shams told him about, Rumi gave the credit to his son Sultan Walid for immortalizing his poems, for he was the one who memorized them by copying them all, and a number of his disciples helped him. And despite Rumi's old age, he continued his path, as there is no specific point that can be reached. It will continue as long as the dervishes continue to rotate and dance like the flow of water. During the novel, we lived 2 stories. The first of Ella and her family and her meeting with Aziz, allowing love to change her, and how she learned to accept what she could not change in her relationship with her children, and to enjoy living the moment, and in the end Ella chose love. Aziz love, and most importantly, love for herself by pulling herself out of her monotonous life and her marriage that devoid of love. In the second story, we learned a lot about Jalal al-Din al-Rumi, especially about Shams al-Tabrizi, whom many mistakenly understood, and not everyone accepted his difference, unlike the Rumi, who realized the love inside him. And how love made Shams immortal forever, through the Rumi poetry and dervish dances. The novel also presented many messages about love, peace, forgiveness, hope, and inner goodness. Unfortunately, through the summary we were not able to present the 40 rules of Shams for love, and the wonderful stories that he mentioned during the pages of the novel. But we hope that everyone will be able to read the novel, as it will change your life forever, fill it with love, and perhaps open a third eye in your hearts, as it did for us and for the Rumi.
Thanks for your generous watching. If you like the video, please subscribe the channel, press the like button, and activate the notifications.